Welcome to today's Harvard Data Science Initiative Industry Seminar. I'm Jen Chow, I'm Director of External Engagement, and I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Leah Comment from Foundation Medicine. Leah is Director of Decision Sciences at Foundation Medicine. She's an epidemiologist, a statistical scientist, and an expert on causal inference for observational data, methods for analyzing time-to-event outcomes, and formal models of decision-making under uncertainty. Leah graduated in 2019 with a PhD in biostatistics from Harvard, and since then has been leading work at Foundation to transform data-driven decision support and clinical trial design with real-world oncology data. Leah is deeply connected to our communities here, and I can't tell you how delighted we are to welcome her back. So before I hand over to Leah, I'd like to remind our audience that there will be time after her presentation for questions. Audience members should use the Q&A at the bottom of the screen to send in their questions at any point during the presentation. Thanks, and welcome, Leah.
I'm Leah Comment. Thank you so much for this opportunity. If you see me like looking up, it's because I have some folks here in the room, the team that worked with me on this, and just really excited to be able to share this with you. Thanks again to HDSI for inviting me. So since I joined Foundation Medicine in 2019, I've been working in this area, let's say causal data science, and we're really focusing on in the context of personalizing treatment decision-making in cancer. So Foundation Medicine is a cancer biotech, and I've been working in that context using what is called real-world data, if that doesn't mean anything to you, and you can sort of use it largely interchangeably with observational data. So today's roadmap. I'm going to introduce me and the team that worked on this, the problem we set out to attack, what we landed on as this idea that what we were looking for was something that was causal interpretability, and one way that we look to try to improve our chances of getting something causally interpretable was through an application of something called the target trial framework. So I'll work through how we actually implemented that. And then I'll get to the nuts and bolts of the data science. We built a modeling pipeline that used machine learning for causal inference. And the specific type of causal inference that we were looking to make was about something called conditional average treatment effects. So I hope by the end of it, I will convince you that that's a rational thing to be interested in if you're interested in personalized decision making. Sort of we'll talk about one of the big challenges that we encountered, which is causal model selection and thinking about how to evaluate things, which becomes a problem very quickly as you start to consider many algorithms. And I'm going to introduce 3 tactics that we identified that helped us navigate that. Then I'm going to have some concluding thoughts, but just want to remind you all views expressed here are my own and not the views of my employer. Okay, so introduction. A little bit about me. So my background is in microbiology and molecular genetics at Michigan State. Got sucked in very early into doing epidemiology research before I knew what was, maybe it wasn't even called causal inference then. Knew I was pre-public health. Went to Michigan for epidemiology, and then really got interested in how does this causal inference stuff really work? And that's why I came to Harvard for a PhD in biostatistics. And since then, I've joined Foundation Medicine, where I've been since 2019, and most recently have been in something called the F2 Insights Lab. And it's F2 because it's Flatiron and Foundation Medicine. And this data science incubation unit is focused on researching and prototyping oncology insights. So these are things that we're hoping or looking to explore types of products for Flatiron Health and Foundation Medicine. And because of that, this is, I would say, a little unusual for industry data science, the type of stuff we're doing. And I think one of the great things that I remember about seminar series like these is they really expose you to all different types of, industry is not a monolith. So there's all sorts of industry data science. So what's a little unusual about this is almost all data scientists will tell you that you spend an absurd amount of time cleaning, wrangling your data, things like that. And we got to spend less time than usual on that. So for real world data especially, we were starting with unusually clean, unusually high quality, unusually structured real world data. This derived from electronic health records of oncology clinics. And then we also had this directive to investigate things that could be differentiated. And one of the paths to differentiation could be methodological. So trying to think about like, is one of the ways that we could do things better than a competitor, something about the way that we analyze the data. And that gave us the freedom to sort of pursue things that might be a little more cutting edge methodologically. And then we also had pre-existing team member expertise for causal inference for precision medicine, people who had been working both in theory and practice, like sort of at this cutting edge for a little bit. So this is all of these things that happened in this sort of local context, and I think it's unusual, but not unheard of for industry. So really thinking about supporting clinical decision making, you probably have heard quite a bit about evidence-based medicine and precision medicine, and those things are hard to reconcile. So when you think about what is evidence for something, and I'll refer to this a couple times, but like this A versus B. And what I mean by A versus B is like, usually I'm talking about it in the context of like, here's a drug A and here's a drug B. And I think I could go in either direction. And I want to know which one would be the better direction to take. And so when you're trying to think about, like the typical way that you'll see causal inference used for evidence-based decision making, it's targeting average effects, because that's, there are a lot of decisions that you would make, take your action based on the average effect. So it's appropriate for policy making, the types of things like, does this drug get approved? So this informs recommendations for broad populations. So if you think I'm a data scientist, the task that I've been given is to really like, there's a spectrum of, different like things of, you could either be leaning towards A or leaning towards B. Where do I want to like really put down my marker? And you want to think about like, what is my estimation strategy for really making sure that when I, make an assertion here, like people believe that this is close to the number it's supposed to be. So there's something called heterogeneous treatment effects, and this is sort of leveraging this or exploiting this is the basis for personalized medicine. If everybody reacts the same, then we don't need to personalize. But there's a lot of evidence that people do not react the same, and that's where there's ambiguity that we could help resolve. So here's a population of people where some people do better on A, some people do better on B, and maybe some people it doesn't really make much of a difference. If your goal was average treatment effect estimation, you'd sort of put it through that machinery and you'd come up with something that says, it looks like B is slightly better. And then you would say, my recommendation, if you make me choose, I'm going to recommend B. You might say something like it's a weak recommendation or something like that. But ultimately, that's the type of thing you get from an average treatment effect. And the type of like gold standard way to establish an average treatment effect like this is a randomized controlled trial. And that's because you're getting causality sort of by the design of the trial. So we really wanted to have a similar basis for action. So as we thought about like what it is that we're going to try to do, it was important that even though we weren't in any position to be running a trial here, to have that randomization, we still wanted it to be interpretable somewhat similar to that. Okay, so think about it from the perspective of a physician who has to make a decision. This person could be quite busy, could be treating many different disease areas, has a lot of things on their minds. And so they're really considering treatment options, not in the sort of like, geez, should I have, approve a drug? That's not the context they're in. They're thinking about it in the context of decision making for a specific patient. And that something about that patient is triggering in their mind, I think I'm choosing between A and B. And then it might bring to mind that, oh, okay, what do I know about A and B? I know there's a population. I have some beliefs about how heterogeneous it is. But they're not working from the same information that an average treatment effect estimator or a policymaker is working from. They know things that are specific about this patient. And oh dear, we have some cutoff here. But they have factors that they know about it. And as a result of that, that helps them place sort of where this person might be, right? They know things that might lean them towards A versus lean them towards B. So we really want to facilitate that reasoning, not replace it. And in order to do that, we want to make sure that the evidence or the way that we're interacting with doctors when we're actually trying to help them make a decision complements the understanding and the reasoning that they already have developed over the course of their clinical practice. So for us, that meant we wanted to be able to present something like what they see from clinical trials, which is something, here's a Kaplan-Meier curve, where it would say, this is our belief about how your patient will fare if you were to go, take this route versus another one. So we wanted to be able to have this type of visualization talking about outcomes that they already know are relevant. If I wanted to do that, and only that, that is a really potentially high impact paper if you choose the right decision node. But one of the great things about working in industry is there's this potential to scale the benefits of the work you do to deliver greater impact. So we're not just thinking about A versus B in this one context. That is a paper. You could get really good at writing those papers, but it is not a clinical decision support product. So you could think about sort of expanding. You want to be able to do different combinations, different populations of people, really expanding the space of decision nodes that you're helping people manage their decisions during. And when you know that you're in this world, you approach things differently. You really focus on things that are repeatable processes, things that you can boil down to like, here is what we need to do in order to accomplish this. And here's what it looks like to ensure the quality if I'm not sort of like babysitting this procedure. If I'm not carefully reviewing things, what does it look like to make sure that I know that the end result is just as a high quality of a product? And in order to do that, you really have to think about this sort of operations mindset. And this ops mindset, you might have heard of things like ML ops or DevOps. It's sort of trying to think about that and applying it towards this type of causal reasoning question. So we're not going to solve all of these at once. The key, it's nice to get specific from the beginning. So we started with a specific A versus B question in the context of lung cancer. And it's actually not metastatic, non-small cell lung cancer. And the metastatic means that, it's fairly advanced. And we're thinking about something, we're supporting what is called a first line therapy selection decision. So this is soon after a patient has realized or has been diagnosed as having a metastatic or advanced cancer. And our A here is immunotherapy. And this is a class of drugs called IO. And then whether or not we would add on top chemotherapy. So this is the sort of classic toxic cancer drug that you're probably quite familiar with. So this is the type of A and B we want to support. So of all the different letters we could have picked, why did we start with this one? And the reason for that was we felt like there was unmet need for a decision support product here. We thought that it was a common decision, that people didn't know what to do there. There were not clear-cut biomarkers you could develop necessarily that would immediately tell you what thing to do. We knew that both clinical factors and molecular or like tumor-specific factors were related to benefit. And there's no head-to-head randomized trials for these things. And there probably never will be. So unless you have the ability to, start up a randomized trial, we have to think about how do we efficiently use the data that we're collecting through clinical practice. And then thinking about, okay, well, the data we have available are these real world data. What's helpful is to have a long duration since it's been sort of on the market. And that means we have a lot of potential follow-up time. Because if something has just entered the market a month ago, you're probably not going to have a whole lot of follow-up time. And so that's one thing that makes the problem somewhat attractive. And these are also this goes back to the common decision, but we see these being used a lot in the data. And that is what drives sample size when you have sort of this real world data. So I mentioned that we really thought that part of what we could do to sort of supplement this reasoning and make sure that the evidence we were providing would be sort of safe and nice to work into a clinician's mental model is to really have causal interpretability be a key goal here. And the way we operationalize that is with the target trial framework. And this is a framework. I don't think this is the only way to get to something that's causally interpretable, but it is a fairly, it's closer to a tried and true way. So a target trial is sort of like the randomized trial that you can imagine conducting that would conclusively answer your causal question. And by the time you're talking about a target trial, you're probably not actually thinking that you would run a trial, but it helps you sort of identify and avoid sort of these very classic observational analysis problems where you end up sort of shooting yourself in the foot. So this two-step process is that you really define this target trial protocol in terms of like, what would that trial look like? And then you execute your analysis plan of the real world data really in accordance with that. And so here are some references, but this is sort of, yeah, I'll go through this. So we really wanted to think about how do we, take the target trial framework and make it something scalable that we can implement in our specific context. And this is like almost like the problem definition. So I'm going to go through what that looked like here. So eligibility criteria, these are like the inclusion exclusion criteria of your trial. But here it's also, like sort of, you can think about it as the series of filtering steps that take your, potentially eligible patients and turn it into your analysis data set. And one of the noteworthy things here is some of our exclusion criteria in particular are based on biomarkers, and that's because we didn't think that all of these options were appropriate for people that had certain biomarker values. We thought that could potentially be a problem. That wasn't exactly the trial we wanted to run, but those biomarkers are not always available in clinical practice. And what you have to do then is, work under that uncertainty. And what that looks like in our case is that we did an impute then exclude approach. So we used multiple imputation to handle the missingness. And then within individually imputed analysis data sets, we filtered eligible records. So that's how we handled that. So there's also like the problem definition, the A versus B, and this is a little more complicated than a simple A versus B, but it is somewhat similar. So we really created these conditions, or I would say even treatment policies, where it's like we're assigning, and then we're saying that like once you've been assigned to this arm, we're just going to say like you can be managed however your physician thinks is appropriate. And this is one way to somewhat not have to worry about like treatment switching, which is a classic sort of intercurrent event that can sometimes make things particularly difficult. So treatment assignment is where you really start to see some deviations between a randomized trial and a target trial protocol. In a randomized trial, this would be completely randomized. Here we have to assume that it's random, conditional on an adjustment set. And the way that we chose this adjustment set was through expert elicitation of a causal graph or a directed acyclic graph. And there are a lot of ways to use directed acyclic graphs. We kind of ended up using something that was a little bit more of a gist of a directed acyclic graph, because the way that we use that input was only to say what are the adjustment variables that are needed at different stages. So that's really the only way that we used our DAG. And then we used those adjustment sets that had been identified as sort of the configuration for the modeling pipeline. And just as a practical note, one uncertainty we had fairly early on was how detailed did the DAG need to be? And as we were working with these experts and having those conversations, we found that the level of detail when things were like very, very granular, it was actually complicating the conversations with our experts. So we ended up doing something that was significantly simpler. And again, the only way that we were really using this was these adjustment variable sets. So one of the easiest ways to screw up an observational data analysis is to screw up your time zero. So this start and end of follow-up are so important. And here, again, this is one of those things that could have been really difficult if we didn't have structured data, but it was actually quite easy for us. So like the start of the follow-up is whenever you started a first line that was in accordance with either of the two conditions we were interested in. And then the end of follow-up was at either the patient's death or the last time the database was refreshed. So that's the cutoff. And I'm going to add like one little note here, which is that actually technically because we used a discrete time model, we technically have our follow-up start on the first of the month. But the reason to use a discrete time model, I'll get into in a little bit. So in cancer, unfortunately, we have the benefit, I guess, of having an outcome that everybody can agree is important, which is all-cause mortality. And so we're really using this because we think if we present information on whether or not like A versus B changes your overall mortality, that's something you would want to act on. So that's a meaningful outcome that would actually change behavior. So what that looks like here is that even if you switch off of this treatment, we're following you up until death or the database cutoff. And how you actually define this endpoint, things like that, quite important. But again, we sort of had the easy button in the sense that our colleagues at Flatiron Health had already done a lot of work and had already validated sort of their endpoint definitions. Okay, so the final thing that is kind of unusual from a target trial, the way that we've implemented the target trial here is a randomized trial, I think I might have mentioned, usually targets an average treatment effect. And here, if you just had an average treatment effect, it wouldn't make for a very good clinical decision support tool. It would always say the same thing regardless of the patient in front of you, and that would be a pretty suboptimal user experience. So what we were focusing was on conditional average treatment effects and how you translate, here's my endpoint of survival, into something that tells you a number that you should take to mean like, I should do this thing, is kind of important. So we looked at restricted mean survival times. A lot of times when people are using time to event data, they look at hazard ratios. Those are problematic for a number of reasons, but especially in our area, these immunotherapies are kind of known for having a long tail. So hazard ratios don't really necessarily capture the type of benefit we're looking for. So we thought you'd see that benefit mostly on the 2-year time horizon. And then we chose to look at it on an absolute scale in order to have that sort of like, what is the absolute benefit? Because those are the types of things that, there's been work actually done by folks at Harvard about decision makers feeling more comfortable with working with things on a different scale, the absolute scale rather than a relative scale. So the conditioning factors here were things that had been sourced from our clinician colleagues. You can ECOG, you can think about that as roughly as a stand-in for like patient health, how frail are they? And there's PD-L1, which a biomarker, and then patient age, that obviously has a lot to do with it. So we wanted to be able to show this type of, if you were to do this, you might be able to expect this would happen to you, conditioning on this personalization traits. And we chose a small number of them because we didn't really want, you have to think, how long do I want this physician to be actually like typing in the stuff on the patient? So it has to do with the usability. So in this kind of thing, it's the area between these survival curves. Here, I think I'm showing the 1 year, but you can attribute that here. It would be based on these things, the chemo attributable benefit. And so that tells you there's a lot of chemo attributable benefit. Maybe you want to go through the pain and like annoyance of going and getting chemotherapy. Okay. So I hope I've motivated why we're looking at CATES or conditional average treatment effects. And then there's the final part of the target trial protocol, which is specifying your analysis plan. And this is where it starts to get pretty complicated. So this can be really overwhelming, especially if this is the first time you've seen it. But this is sort of our modeling pipeline, what it looked like. We had data inputs over here on the left. On the right, we have these personalized visualizations, and this is supposed to be the thing that is starting to help people make decisions based on personalized evidence. And then sort of in the middle here, we have some classic data science tasks around like wrangling, defining the population, and then, here we see in these gray things, these are what would look like individually fairly standard machine learning tasks. So you might think about each one of those as being a normal, like standard ML task. And then because, we really want to make sure that we have causal interpretability or we're in the right realm there, it's quite important to consider different algorithms. So each of these submodel types, we had multiple implementations or different algorithms. And then I just had mentioned this already, but for the hazard models, we had a discrete time format. And the reason there's this connection between like classifiers and time to event data. And this really opened up the space of types of algorithms we could use for our time to event data. So each of those things individually is like important, as part of the piece of the picture. But these submodels particularly define our overall Kate estimation procedure. So we should think about like evaluating, does this thing work well holistically, like as part of this whole pipeline, rather than as a specific model. And that is foreshadowing. But here are some of the things that just like were, just very practical, influenced by the fact that we were going to be showing interacting and proposing that people interact with this in a way that didn't require them to sit down and type things a lot. So we kept our number of personalization traits quite low. And then we really wanted to work to make sure that the evidence we were presenting was really intuitive and made sense right from the get-go for clinicians, because we really wanted them to be incorporating this into their mental model rather than like using this or having this come in conflict, so they're actually leaving more uncertain about what to do. And then we also wanted some way for them to examine and be like, does this make sense? Like, does this actually work there? The way that we actually sort of harmonized this like ML pipeline to this causal target trial specification is we really look to have ways that we could make sure that this document that is our specification was aligned with the pipeline that we had configured. So we actually the key part here, I had mentioned that we had looked at the directed acyclic graph, determined the adjustment variable sets, determined the pipeline specification, and the key part there was really these model formulas. So really making sure that it all, after through all this iteration, that we were still configured to be targeting the right question that we had set out to do. So just want to mention there are many different things you can do, and they happen to be special cases of this pipeline structure. So the kind of different assumptions as you go down, it gets fancier and fancier, and also more and more robust to some of the things that we think it needs to be robust to. So I might refer to it as the Diaz model. So the most complicated thing that we sort of evaluated was this doubly robust pseudo outcome regression, which has a bunch of really nice theoretical properties, but actually uses all 4 of these model types. Oh, I see something in the Q&A. Okay. All right. So the way that we actually got to, having a lot of candidate algorithms in our pipeline was to use the tidy models universe. So a lot of these causal methods, like those submodels, you can base them on some of the same implementations, and we really leveraged the tidy models universe and Parsnip to have sort of a generic interface, so that if we implemented a random forest for propensity scoring, we would, with very minimal changes, be able to adapt it to our time to event model. And so we looked at models of varying flexibility. And flexibility is sort of, I would say, maybe the hallmark of maybe where the line between a statistical model and a machine learning model is, if there is such a line. But the reason to pursue model flexibility, besides just, oh, it's fun and cool, is in this case, really, we were aiming for causal interpretability, and it's not just what variables you condition on, it's how you do it. So statistical model misspecification can lead to residual confounding, which is another way of saying you're not getting the causal interpretability you're hoping for. So there's very flexible models, very simple models that you would have learned in your Stat 101 course. And these also like have varying degrees of software implementation. Some of these are used all the time, well-worn packages. You know, we would know if there was a bug here because a million people would have probably encountered it by now. And these vary in their need for tuning. And so that's, you know, a consideration when you're thinking about searching across sort of a model space. So you have to both think about like, well, how can I validate that this software is doing what this paper that, you know, sort of justified it was doing? And then also like, how do I actually implement the tuning? So I said foreshadowing. So at the bleeding edge, sometimes you get cut. So this causal model selection problem is still open. Would love help in solving it. Once you have sort of many models that you're considering, you have to have some principled way of saying which one you're going to go with. And these models or these submodels differ with their ability to access it with a ground truth. And this is where I think maybe there's a little bit of a line between ML and causal ML, right? So some of these things can be evaluated just with their predictive ability. Does this propensity score work? And it's a pretty standard evaluation and tuning thing. So you can kind of like locally optimize, or that might be an approach you would think would be sensible. So you could just say like, you know, I'm going to hold out some of this data. Did it work? But when these models are being used in the context of the overall Kate estimation procedure, you know, all of a sudden the idea that you can locally optimize and that leads you to something that is more overall optimized, it turns out that's not really totally the case. So it's not necessarily that the optimal thing individually is the optimal combination of submodels. And part of that is that these bias variance trade-offs can start to interact, which is very cool from a theoretical perspective, sometimes a little annoying from a practical perspective, but there's like active research here about, well, like, what does that mean we should be using as the metrics for overall success? You know, it looks like there's no magic metric that we just haven't stumbled across, that things do differently in different things. But this is an area of active theory, including by some folks in my group. So these are the submodels, and unfortunately, it's not a matter of just doing our best in each of those. And then there's the fundamental problem of causal inference, right? Which is that like, I want to know how well does this particular combination of personalization factors and the model I use there explain this sort of underlying late individual, yeah, and it should sound like there's not a ground truth available, and you would be right. So we lack ground truth for Kates. So this is an active area, but it's not totally hopeless. These were things we learned that, you know, actually turned out to be quite helpful for navigating sort of frontier. So first one is to curate some real world data test cases. And I think about this as like standing in for your expert who, if they sat there and played with your model as you went through millions of iterations, would be like, oh, this one's really bad. This is telling us something insane. So these clinician vetted test cases, you curate them and code them, and then you can use that to like sort of do like sanity checks and understand how sensitive these things are. Because if all of your models are, you know, wrong in similar ways, then maybe that's not a sensible test case. But if you know your models flip back and forth consistently, maybe you haven't really figured out how to hone in on the types of procedures you should be doing. So these are just like formalized expectations turn into sort of tests in a software type of way. So, thinking about curating this evidence, trying to understand how it's related to the target trial population you specified. And here's some examples. We came to love these traffic light tables, which is like, did this thing meet expectations? And then, like, was it violating expectations in a way that was or was not statistically significant? So here's one example readout from the Diaz model. So the other thing that turned out to be a surprise for me, in industry, you oftentimes are not looking to conclusively prove that, the way that you've done it is the absolute best way to do it. So I had been thinking about simulation studies as much more being the realm of academic statistics. But what simulations allow you to do is to have a known ground truth. So one way to deal with a situation where you can't tell whether things recover ground truth is to make a place where you actually, a little playground where you do know the truth. And then you can gradually layer on the complexity and get it closer and closer to the situation you think you're actually in that world where you don't know the ground truth. So this turned out to be valuable for like validating the implementation, identifying bugs, and then you also get to learn about like, are these fine procedures, but not for the sample sizes that we're likely to see? So really, I cannot argue enough for like the importance of having sort of this layering complexity, where you can say like, I know this model should work here and fail here, and then be able to say like, yep, that works like I thought it would. And the final thing is really thinking about automating causal diagnostics. So sort of as an analyst on that, putting yourself in that paper mindset, you have, it's really about being careful, documenting your work, really doing the sensitivity analysis. Here, you're definitely not going to do that every time you fit the model. So you need to think about like, well, what was I trying to learn from those types of things? And how do I turn that into something that can be like sort of a flag that can be raised through the pipeline? So an example here of two important assumptions for causal inference, I'm going to talk about positivity. So what you might do is you might plot propensity score, looking for lack of overlap. This is an important consideration because these people you're probably not actually, estimating very good causal effects for. These are patients that for whatever reason, we're looking at them and we're thinking these are people are not really candidates for IO and chemo, apparently. There's something about their profile that this, wasn't like these people never get treated that way. And then you should think to yourself, why would I want to give them a causal effect, or could I even return a causal effect estimate for them? So turning in that into something that is actually like interpretability modeling, where you can sort of feed that back in to refine either like your inclusion exclusion criteria. We had at least one DAG modification that we came to understand that like the treatment assignment process wasn't as we expected. But it really, this needs to be part of like a continuous integration type of process. Okay, so I think we will have some time for questions, which is great. So some concluding thoughts. I hope that I have convinced you that industry causal data science is really exciting and has the promise to turn all of these vast troves of data into patient benefit at a scale that is pretty exciting. So really to think about not just, being able to make evidence-based decisions, but also to know when the evidence says make an exception for this person, and really like tailoring it towards the types of things that we want to do to see, in a world where people are treated according to the data and evidence, and also in a way that considers their unique traits. This area is also rapidly refining its toolkit. These are some of the relevant papers that came out just in 2023 that, changed how we were thinking about things. This is a subset of the things that have come out. And then also there are existing tools for MLOps and, other types of data science. And these things are rapidly sort of growing their ability to be addressing causal data science things. So data version control, ML flow, I had mentioned some of the tidy models. We also used RENV to sort of harmonize our developer experience, all these different things. There were some sort of improvement that made it work better for us in the course of 2023. And then also, I hope that it was clear that there's absolutely no way for one person to do all of this stuff or to be good at all of the things you need to do it well. So it's quite a team sport. And I'm very grateful to the team that went on this journey with me, and that, for all of the hard work and input and expertise that they shared with it. So thank you, everybody who contributed. I'm looking at them around the room. But yes, very much, this is not just my work. This is the work of a lot of people. So yes, that's one of my favorite things of industry. You don't have to do it alone. And this was a great team to do it with. So with that, I will look for some questions.
Yeah, we've got a few really great ones. And before I get to them, so, one question that I like to ask is taking a step back and thinking about your whole pipeline. What limitations can you think of sort of in your data, sort of inherent in your data? What kind of data do you find is missing? And if you could wave a magic wand, what would you find to be sort of that magic bullet data set? Knowing that, you described your data in the beginning as sort of, wonderfully clean and clinically relevant. What do you think is your sort of magic wand or silver bullet?
I think that really the question for like, what does the perfect data look like? It depends on the question, which I think is, pretty kind of an annoying answer. But in this specific place, I think that when you're sort of thinking about, can I make a causal inference from this data? Is it fit for purpose for what I'm trying to do here in this context of clinical decision support? It's really important to understand this is how patients are being treated in the wild. And so like, how are physicians making that? And not everything, like if this is based on electronic health record, not everything is really systematically codified and recorded. So ideal data for me would be things like, and this is like partly a health system change that's needed, but really to think about like really objective quantitative measures of like, what does this patient's tumor burden look like? Because there's all these different factors that doctors can either literally see or, are taking into account when they're making these decisions. And you can't quite perfectly recreate that using the structured data that gets recorded. So I would say as we see sort of more documentation that is sort of not just a clinician note of how they feel about it, I think that will be a data set that's better suited for this.
That's an interesting, right? Handling unstructured data is definitely one of the frontiers. How do you actually extract the information that you need? Question here about deployment in the clinic. How do you handle communicating uncertainty about the numbers provided to physicians? Do you have a threshold for not providing any recommendation if for a particular combination of patient characteristics, the prediction is too broad? So I guess, when you're deploying these models, how do you translate that into actual physician communication?
Yeah, so I will also say all of the things you saw didn't really communicate any uncertainty just because it's hard to do that. But we think really, first of all, that absolute minimum, you need to communicate that uncertainty. For us, that was through confidence intervals, things like that. Everything was multiply imputed and bootstrapped. I kind of glossed over that. But yes, you do need to communicate that uncertainty. I think one of the interesting things about clinical decision making versus something like, should I approve a drug, is the decision needs to be made right now. So it's a matter of, is imperfect information better than nothing? And so in that case, I'm not big on null hypothesis testing in general. So I just don't know that p-values are super important. I do think that, we had considered looking at like, particularly understanding that population refinement to make sure that we weren't providing recommendation or like we weren't saying anything about what a causal effect might be in those areas where we thought this was pretty far out on a limb. This patient had a really low propensity to be treated. Those people might just benefit from descriptive statistics, like 9 out of 10 doctors in your position have assigned, this patients like these to chemo, or whatever it is. So I think there's understanding that component and making those types of things transparent so they can be discovered. But I also don't think I just don't necessarily think that you need to control discoveries, or like fault those things at quite the same level, as long as you're being accurate about your uncertainty quantification.
Yeah. We had another question about gaining clinicians' trust, but I think you kind of you covered that. I think that occasionally you don't need sort of the newest methodologies and thinking about how do you communicate versus tried and true models that exist out there.
From
Another
perspective,
sorry, go
sorry,
ahead.
for the how do you gain trust with that sort of thing? Part of that was implementing some of those standard things and then showing like that didn't work. So Cox models, because of these proportional hazards type of things, that was in our set of candidate models. I didn't really talk too much about it, but we did consider the things that people would be more familiar with. And we wanted to make sure that we couldn't, that you actually did need something fancier than that. But with sort of the observational data, it's really a simple average that is very transparent on how you calculate it. If you present that in a certain way, in a certain context that might make it seem like it could be interpreted just as easily as a randomized trial, that's just not, that can be worse than if you gave them no information at all. So it is really important that you're trying to screen things and only be doing things that could be causally interpretable. Because I think it's too easy, especially if you're mostly looking at clinical trial all day, to sort of pick those up and attach an interpretation that doesn't belong there.
Yeah, I think that gaining trust is actually, what we're talking about, and I think that's so critical. I have a question here that's a little bit more granular. When simulating the data for checking ML models, are you using different models to generate simulations, or what is the approach? Can you speak to that?
So we were building our, as I mentioned, didn't know we were going to need simulation infrastructure. So we were kind of building it as we were going along. And we didn't start totally from scratch because we've been doing enough methods work to have some of that already implemented. But, so it is really important to be able to like get to something that is closer to the problem. If you want your simulations to be able to demonstrate anything to you or to help you gain confidence in what you're doing in a particular scenario, you want it to mimic it in key ways. And so, if you assume something very, very simple is the underlying process, then, you're probably, if you don't think that's the real process, it's probably going to be, now you're wondering, but would this work in a more complicated process? So that's the layering on. You should start simple, because that is where, if it doesn't work in the simple stuff, it's definitely not going to work for the harder stuff. So it is a matter of adding more complexity, maybe start drawing your event times from an exponential distribution, then start to do it from, like generate it from a fitted Kaplan-Meier curve or something like that, and then really layer on that complexity till it starts to mimic, this had about the same amount of censoring as my data set.
Interesting. It's the reverse Swiss cheese model.
Yeah.
So now going, by the way, Giovanni Parmigiani says hello and wonderful talk, Leah.
Thank you, Giovanni.
So we have a question here about implementing causal in industry. So for example, lots of projects in industry are still designed in a traditional way. For example, using a new user cohort study with propensity score matching, and convincing pharma to conduct target trials may be challenging. What should be the starting point to get everyone involved in causal sciences in industry?
Ooh, that's a really, really tough question. I would say that, like, whether or not you want to take on the formality of a target trial approach, if if you're doing things, what are the same things you would have done as if you'd gone through the whole target trial protocol, but like you don't actually, you're skipping the part where you specify it, but then you're going to use the same exact propensity scoring and everything like that. If you're doing all those right things, you're already doing it. You're just not calling it that. So sometimes you don't need to necessarily pursue it with that degree of formality. If you think that you do need that degree of formality and rigor, and this is especially where things that are regulatory facing start to be really important. Like your interactions with regulators, the regulators are setting standards around like, what do they want that evidence to look like? And so, there have been some recommendations around target trial frameworks and things like that. So I do think regulators play a huge role in being able to say, what do I think, what is the standard for conducting something like this? But yeah, I would say that you probably like there are some times where the simple analysis, that's all that's needed. And it's really about spending your effort on the places where if you get it wrong, it's particularly bad or dangerous. And we thought like where you're deploying and exposing sort of people to evidence that you're still not even sure how they're gonna understand it, that we thought that was a place where it made sense to be more careful about it.
A follow-up question that I have is, do you think regulators are ready for this, or maybe they're already there? Can you comment on where we are in terms of regulatory bodies?
I mean, I think there are a couple of different things. So I think that all of the ways that people are just like, well, here's some algorithm I trained on some data, no oversight or recommendations, you're sort of free to take it up or not. I think that is a pretty dangerous approach to doing things. So there has been some guidance around like medical devices and things like that, the use of algorithms there, I think those are just good guardrails. We should be, especially, as we're at a pretty high point in the AI hype curve, we really don't want to be, compromising the integrity or the quality of decision making for things like this, for, cancer patients' treatment plans, because the doctor's not understanding the limitations of a model. So I think that's pretty important from like regulatory drug approval type of thing. Part of the thing of real world data, it's sort of about that passive or nearly passive data collection, but you can't collect information about a new thing till it's starting to be used in clinical practice. So real world data tends to be a little bit behind the curve in terms of the questions it can answer. And I think really we're trying to figure out how does it sort of get pulled in earlier stages. But it is ultimately, where does it make sense to be able to apply these things, because the past is not the future.
That's incredibly insightful. And I think we'll end on one final question, which is sort of a very broad one, but do you have any tips for grad students who are interested in causal data science in industry, especially in health applications? Maybe foundationally, how would you go about, without a PhD in biostatistics, how would you go about getting into this space?
I would say look for organizations that have both some access to data, so they have some desire to be doing things with analytics, and really a real mission, like some way to create patient benefit, because it's those people in those organizations that really want to be analyzing data in the way that is most actionable. And I would say that's where you're going to see sort of accrual of people who are good at causal inference and causal data science. And it's working with people who are good at it, and really like being able to sort of push that and be putting it in these application areas. And you'll just be in an organization that's more receptive to that if they have this drive to be working on, what is the best right thing to do. And I personally find that those to be ways to like search for people that already kind of are inclined to be doing these types of things.
Favorite paper from the past few years? And we'll end on that.
No, okay. I'm very much off But I would say the it's one of the ones I featured. Let me see if I can go back around our sort of challenging, unsolved question. And I would say it's this Kurth paper. I just thought it was surprisingly insightful, and just kind of a delight. And I've read it now a couple of times, and it's one of those things that I pick up on something different every time I read it, which I think is a sign of a really good paper. So I thought it was interesting and needed. So I'll go with that one.
So anyone who receives our newsletter, look out because we're going to include that in our roundup. All right. Well, thank you, Leah. This is our last industry seminar of our academic year. We'll be releasing details about the fall term in our newsletter, so everyone look out. And thanks again, Leah, and thanks to our participants for your wonderful questions. We will see you soon.